Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy, episode 74. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder, and today, the woman who inspired this whole series on travel podcasting, Adrien Behn of Strangers Abroad. Adrien's narrative-style travel podcast was keeping me dreaming during the early days of the pandemic, and now, on season hiatus. Ugh, no, give me more. But Adrien's working on some new projects this year, or at least one, and you'll have to head over to the Creative Imposter podcast to hear my complimentary episode with her over there right after you finish this episode. It's easy. I've linked it up for you in the show notes in your episode description in your app and at thecreativeimposter.com/pod envy 074. Meanwhile, Adrien is going to be sharing with you right here on Podcast Envy just exactly what it takes to craft the narrative style show that is Strangers Abroad. We're talking themes, arc, multiple storytellers, personal narrative, music, and soundscaping. It's a prime example of what I mean when I say an intentional audio experience for listeners. I mean, your listeners are always having an audio experience. You're having one right now. But is it the one you want them to have? Oh, and Adrien also tips us off as to why she goes to such great lengths to create the show in this way, and tops the whole thing off with whipped cream and a cherry of sound advice. Links to Strangers Abroad and Adrien Behn are right there in the show notes for you. What are you waiting for? Go back to the beginning of the most recent season and add to playlist. You can thank me later. Maybe in a Podcast Envy review. Easy enough to do over at ratethispodcast.com/envy. Or writing podcast reviews not your thing? Share this episode on Instagram and tag me at The Creative Imposter. Thanks. I appreciate it in advance. And now, on with the show. Adrien Behn, thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Envy.
I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. So I'm going to ask you a question. And if it takes you the entire recording session time to answer this question, that's okay. It'll make my job totally easy, which is, why do you travel?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't think we have enough time, actually. I think I've always had it in me. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. And when I went to college, I knew that I wanted to travel somewhere. And I always really loved stories. Like, I just want to talk to people in whatever capacity that I can in any part of the world. And not being able to do that during quarantine has been like a little maddening. So talking to strangers, making friends with people from different corners of the world was just like this incredible gift. And that's really how I started my podcast, was because I was like, we're told all of these stories that the world is dangerous and people cannot be trusted. And it's not true. Like, when you go out and you actually do it, I would say I found that the world is much more protective than predatory.
So let's talk about Strangers Abroad.
Yes.
From listening to Strangers Abroad, I have heard a lot of your personal travel stories. And then you also, I think of you as like a story collector.
And I love that.
Collect stories from other travelers as well. Why do you make this show? I'm saying it like that because I'm talking with some other travel podcasters right now for this series. And it's one thing to make a show like this one that's largely interview-based, where you just meet with one person, you interview them, you edit the questions and answers, and maybe you do some solo episodes. But the type of show that you're producing is almost like an entirely different animal. It feels more complex. It feels like a lot more work and probably pre-production and planning goes into crafting an episode. And I know that Strangers Abroad is not your full-time career that you're making a living off of. So why do you make this show?
Oh my God, amazing question. I make this show because if you just boiled me down into a soup, I am a storyteller. Like, first and foremost, that is what I want to be doing always. I want to be telling my own stories, and I want to be listening to other people's stories. That is the thing that unites all of us. And that is the thing that will allow me to connect to some grandpa in Nigeria or some grandmother in Bali, and people who have such totally different lives than me. I can relate to them when we share stories together. So it is the most valuable currency to have. And going back to all of the lessons that I learned, I really want other people to go out and live the most adventurous life that you can, and to fill your life with stories, because it's so easy to live the same exact year over and over and over again. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but I'm saying, like, shake it up a little bit. And telling them, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And I say this especially to women. The world is so much kinder, and we are the first generation of women truly to, like, flex this independence. And I think the reason why Eat, Pray, Love was such a phenomenon was not because it was based off of travel. It was because it was a story about a woman who was fully independent, used her money exclusively for herself, and it happened to be in beautiful places. And we as women have this opportunity now that like my grandmother never had this. And I want to make sure that I am traveling and sharing these stories so that the world will be safer for my niece, who is 2 years old right now. So I very much do, because I think that stories can also, like, make the world a much more peaceful and compassionate place. But then when it comes to the actual format of it, in my heart of hearts, I am a creative. I wake up wanting to make things every single day. My mom is an artist, and I'm the only daughter that, like, really, like, I've got the art gene turned all the way up. And with this season specifically, I do a lot of soundscaping. I play a lot with music. I can't describe it any other way than, like, I heard it. Like, I heard what it was supposed to sound like in my brain, and then I made it. And it's, like, the most, it's not a super eloquent way of explaining it, but I knew that I wanted to share more of my stories. And I do a lot of live storytelling in New York City when I was allowed to be in front of humans. And I love telling my own stories. And I really loved creating a season that was based off of that internal exploration. So my second season, every episode is in chronological order of a stage that we as travelers experience.
Yeah.
So it could be anything from, like, the first episode is really just anxiety of, like, oh my God, I'm so scared, I'm so excited, and I want to go. And so I walk the audience through, this is what it feels like before you get on the plane, packing up all of your stuff and dealing with your family and getting on the plane and waiting for it to take off. And then you're gone, and, like, your anxiety shifts a little bit. So we go through every stage from, like, identity to getting lost to falling in love to being attacked by monkeys. And because that happens to every traveler, but that's, like, a worried episode. And one of my very close storytelling friends, Adam Selbest, tells the most amazing story about being attacked by monkeys in India. And we talk about all of the realness that happens when you travel, because I think that Instagram really skews your perception of what travel is like.
Yes.
Like, I have this joke where I'll start a set and I'll be like, I'm a travel writer. And I know that when you hear that, you just think of all of those Instagram images of a girl in a sundress in front of the Taj Mahal. But I promise you that she has explosive diarrhea. Like, you don't go through India. India goes through you. Like, travel is not glamorous, but it's so rewarding. I love nothing more than it's, like, 4 a.m. and I'm about to get on a train. I don't have any makeup. My hair's up in a bun. I am my most beautiful in that moment. And I just really wanted to share, like, the honest aspects of it. And I wanted to be incredibly vulnerable during all of that. And that's why I chose to share my own stories and soundscape it. So it really sounds like you're with me in it, because I think that vulnerability that's the only way that people are going to connect with you. And I love being vulnerable. I don't have any fear around it, because I know that it's actually a superpower when you really step into it. And I've gotten like a lot of very kind feedback because of it. Yeah, I just wanted to be honest.
And now it's time for some serious podcast angel action shining down on you with an amazing resource that's totally new. Well, new to Podcast Envy and maybe new to you too. This podcast angel has a first and last name, and that is Mighty Networks. And Mighty Networks is a triple threat opportunity for you today. First up, let's say you've been looking for a way to create an engaged community around your podcast. The Facebook group just isn't cutting it. Or you're looking for a way to earn a little cashola from your already engaged and growing community. Patreon just hasn't worked for you yet. Well, Mighty Networks is bridging the gap. You can easily create both free and paid communities, groups, online courses, etc. for a low monthly fee. The user experience is lovely. Your members' interactions are not being sold to the highest bidder like on Facebook, and Mighty Networks is rolling out new features like events calendar syncing all the time. How do I know? Because of opportunity number 2. I've created a totally free network called the Creative Imposter Collective, named for my other podcast, The Creative Imposter. And let's say you are a multi-passionate creative individual who thrives in a judgment-free space that is safe for sharing works in progress, providing constructive feedback, and engaging with new ideas, where vulnerability is encouraged and personal growth fostered. And due to being stuck mostly at home these days, you are craving a new way to beat creative blocks, banish self-doubt, and test drive projects in process with folks who share your non-traditional work-life schedule. Whew, that was a mouthful. But if any of those words sounded like you, then the Creative Imposter Collective may be just the thing you need to get you through this winter. And last but not least, I did say triple threat, didn't I? And I've saved the best for last. Let's say you're a podcaster listening to this episode and every episode of Podcast Envy, and you're thinking, I wish I knew how to bring more narrative elements into my podcast, write better scripts, add more music, follow up with guests, train my voice, find sponsors, build my own community on Mighty Networks. Who could I ask about that? Well, I have a solution for you, and it's not just one podcast boss you can ask, it's many. I am right now taking applications for my brand new Podcast Envy Boss Pod. Podcast Boss BI Pod? Truth be told, I haven't decided what to call it yet, but I know exactly what it will be. This is an intimate, curated group of professionals who podcast from a variety of entrepreneurial and content creative backgrounds, coming together for a monthly strategy session to solve your most pressing questions around growth, sustainability, craft, and culture. Membership includes other perks like show features on Podcast Envy, one-on-one coaching with me, access to my craft and culture behind-the-scenes podcast, and you guessed it, an online hub on Mighty Networks. So, to learn more about creating your own Mighty Network or to join the Creative Imposter Collective for free, click the respective link in the show notes in this episode description in your app and at thecreativeimpostor.com/podenvy074 to learn more about the Podcast Envy Boss Boss Club, whatever it's called, and apply for the waitlist to be the very first cohort. Go to thecreativeimpostor.com/boss pod. Also, of course, linked for you in the show notes. And now, let's get back to my conversation with Adrien. Do you record at all while you travel, or do you do all of your recording after you're back? Are any of those sounds actual location sounds, or are they all sourced after the fact?
Yeah, so I started, when I was doing my first season, most of those recordings were done in person, and then some of them were done on Skype. Most of my recordings for my second season was all done on Zoom or in person because I had a lot of my New York City storytelling friends on it. But I do record sound. You know, like, I don't know, there was one time I lived in Mexico City for a month and a half. And there was one time where I just like heard this flute just out of nowhere. Cause I stayed in like a residential area that was like on the offskirt of like a more popular area. And I just heard this flute and I was like, where's this coming from? So I have a sex little Tascam. She's super tiny and she picks up such good audio. So I just walked around waiting to find this man just playing his flute in the middle of the street just because he could. Mm-hmm. And I did it throughout Southeast Asia. And then whenever I hear a really fun sound, I'm like, oh my God, I want this. I take a long time. I take a really long time making sure that I find the right sound for what I am looking for in that moment.
Yeah. And then related to that, soundscaping and playing with music in the context of your episodes is such a missed opportunity for most of us. It's something that I want to do more of, but I'm also very conscious of the amount of time.
It's exhausting. It took me a year and a half to make all of that with the recordings and then editing all the recordings down, because what I did was like, I knew the themes that I wanted. Yeah. So I specifically sought out the stories that I wanted to tell because I knew that they were out there.
Yeah.
And then based on each theme, I wrote and recorded my own story and then soundscaped and did music on top of that. So it took me a year and a half and way longer than, anybody thinks it's going to take. Yeah. But it's so worth it. I wouldn't do it. I know that this is the easier version. And I get why a lot of people do this version, but it's just not how I rock. And I would rather take the time to make something that like, I don't do this now because I'm like, I need some emotional distance from my season, but like, I will go back and listen to it and be like, yeah, I got it. It's like kind of the first time that I feel very proud of my second season. There isn't an episode where I'm like, oh, that was weird. Like I feel very confident, which is an uncomfortable thing to say as a woman because we're not taught to be confident. But yeah, I know that I did the best that I could, given that I'm not getting paid to do this and I'm doing it alone.
Yeah. And with your voice too, I mean, you mentioned that you do preface each episode telling a personal story that takes us into the theme and into the moment. And you said that you do live in-person storytelling. And that's one thing that I've always appreciated about your show too, is how expressive you are when you are telling these stories vocally, just with your voice and the way that you tell the story. You're not just conversationally telling it back to me like you are now, but even now in the context of an interview, you're naturally very expressive in your voice. Is that something that you learned or have developed, or is that just your natural way of speaking and expressing yourself? Like how much of it is nurture, how much of it is nature?
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you so much for noticing my voice. Like I love the sound of my voice. No, I have an acting background. So I spent, since I was 10, I was on stage and spent almost 10 years just doing theater and very much honed that. And I am definitely a performer. People say that public speaking is their number one fear. I'm like, you don't need to pay me to get on stage. Like I will go up there gladly for nothing. So I think one of the reasons why I chose to podcast instead of doing a blog when I first created it is because it does itch my need to perform.
Yeah.
And that was kind of one of the reasons why I was like, oh, I'm sticking with this. Because before, like I had started and stopped all of these little creative projects. But once I got the podcast, I was like, oh no, this is great. I get to tell my own stories and I get to perform again. So a lot of it is, just practice. And I did, pre-COVID, I would get on stage and do shows every week. So it's a very strong muscle of mine.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's sort of like you have the background and the training, but then also it's the more that you use it, the more that you practice, the more that you exercise it, it becomes more natural.
Oh my God. Honestly, now, because I feel very like I know what I want my voice to sound like, it usually doesn't take me more than 2 takes now. And honestly, if I'm like, I really want to just get this done and over with, I'll really try to do it in 1 take and not have to go back and then re-record my voice. But that really does also come in order for that to go off well, that means that I have to be very prepared with my writing and make sure that my writing is tight and that there are no errors in it. And I'm not trailing off. Like, my script has to be pretty polished in order for me to sound like I'm doing it all in one take and that I'm really just sitting down with you and we're walking through this together.
Yeah. Last question. Is there anything else that you want to share with our podcasters and aspiring podcasters for Podcast Envy?
Tell the stories that you really want to tell. Don't tell the stories that my partner and I, who's also a podcaster, he and I do very similar types of storytelling. We've had the conversation of like, do you make art for the audience or do you make art because like you need to do this? And he and I are both in the camps of like, I'm going to make the art that I need to get out of my system because that helps me sleep at night. And that's the reason I wake up in the morning. So tell the stories that you want to tell. Don't worry about like how long it takes for you to do it, because as long as you do it and you do it right. I'm also a big camp of like, take as long as you need. Don't give yourself some bullshit artificial deadline. Like the whole, what is it? Done is better than perfect. I'm like, no, do perfect. Be as perfect as you can be. You get one shot at this. So yeah, tell the stories you really want to tell and that you think other people really need to hear, and take as long as you can to get it right.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.